Okay, gonna go ahead and get us started. Welcome to everybody. Thank you so much for joining this web event, Lessons from South Korea on Resistance to Authoritarianism, hosted by the Institute for Policy Studies. My name is Kari Peterson-Smith, and I am the co-director of the New Internationalism Project at IPS. IPS stands at the intersection of social movements, research, and policy, always for social, economic, and environmental justice. We are honored to host this event, which is the second in a series of web events on lessons from resistance to authoritarianism around the world. Please go ahead and join our email list to stay informed about other events in the series and other events at IPS. The Korean Peninsula, and South Korea in particular, has been a key site of struggle for democracy in many forms, against authoritarianism in many forms. This has included anti-colonial struggle, labor struggle, struggle for demilitarization, and for unification. The lessons have been powerful and the struggles inspiring, and this remains abundantly true in the last episode regarding an attempted coup and its defeat. For these reasons, we are so honored and grateful to have this stellar panel to discuss the recent events and unfolding events. And we are so deeply grateful to have Christine Ahn recently join IPS. Christine joined IPS in January of this year as an associate fellow, and we are so delighted to have her. She is the founder and former executive director of Women Cross DMZ, a global movement of women mobilizing for peace in Korea. She's the recipient of the U.S. Peace Prize and Social Activism Award from the Nobel Peace Laureates. I will pass it to Christine. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kari, and thank you so many of you that are joining from all around the country, and in fact, all around the world. I've seen the attendees pouring in, and it really warms my heart to see some really longtime friends who have been working for peace on the Korean Peninsula. So good evening, good morning, good afternoon to all of you joining. Thanks so much for joining us to learn about the lessons from South Korean resistance to authoritarianism. Thank you, Kari, for that introduction. And it's so wonderful to be at IPS, an organization that I have been connected to for over 20 years. And I'm so now honored to be a part of IPS. It's sort of like returning back to college, except now I'm able to work with amazing other experts like Kari and Phyllis Bennis and Sanho and so many others who are actually putting these progressive ideas into action. So I'd also really like to thank some friends at the Center for Constitutional Rights for inspiring this IPS series. One lawyer pinged me in early January and asked how activists in other countries around the world are resisting authoritarianism, and especially as the far right is gaining power all over the world. So even in Europe, half of the countries now are under right-wing authoritarian regimes. So IPS heeded the call and launched this series last month with the first one by Walton Bello about how pro-democracy forces mobilized to remove Duterte, the first Asian leader to be arrested and detained at The Hague, which is a milestone for international law. Well, another Asian leader that was recently arrested and detained was South Korean President Yoon Yeol. Last December, the former president, Yoon, shocked the world by declaring martial law on national television. He orchestrated the most serious assault on South Korean constitutional order since the country's democratization in the late 1980s. Yoon is part of the rise of a global far right that has used tactics such as disinformation campaigns, conspiracy theories about election fraud, anti-communist propaganda, and even the deployment of vigilantes to commit violence against courts, legislators, police, and journalists, all with the support of tech oligarchs whose social media platforms are used to advance these authoritarian agendas. Well, to help us understand the gravity of what happened that night in December, that Yoon imposed martial law, I'd like to share a short clip narrated by Raphael Rashid, a journalist with the UK Guardian, which is produced by NBC. It shows how quickly an authoritarian leader can usurp democratic controls and deploy armed forces to quash democracy. I think it's really important for us to all kind of see how quickly this can happen. So Netfa, thank you for helping us. Thank you, Netfa. I think we're all a little bit chilled by that video, and it's actually part of a multi-part series, which I'll put in the chat so that folks can watch the rest of that segment. But for those of you that have been following, thankfully, swift organizing by South Korean lawmakers and the citizens called on thousands to rush to the National Assembly to revoke Yoon's order for martial law. As you saw in the video, parliamentarians and citizens, they blocked the troops and climbed the walls to vote 190 to 0 to rescind Yoon's parliamentary order. Yoon was later impeached, and after 100 days of deliberation on April 4th, the Constitutional Court unanimously ruled 8-0 to uphold Yoon's impeachment. So there is now a snap 60-day election underway, and a new president will be elected on June 3rd. Over 127 days, citizens organized from December to just 2 weeks ago the following actions to demand Yoon's ouster. Over 10 million people took to the streets to participate in 67 rallies. That means every other day. 1,000 speeches were made, 220 performances to galvanize the crowd. Their messages included nonviolence, equality, diversity, no hatred, and joy. Well, to discuss the extraordinary civil society movement that quickly mobilized to overturn Yoon's martial law and defended democracy from an authoritarian leader, we have 3 veteran experts to share lessons and insights that can be gleaned by social movements the world over. We will first hear from Francis Dae-Hoon Lee, who is the Director of Trans Education for Peace Institute at Peace Momo, where he provides school teachers and peace activists in Korea with peace education training that is based on new learner-oriented pedagogical principles. Among many other titles, Francis is also Professor for Peace at Samkong-ho University, Rutsi-Meikan University, and the International University of Japan. I first met Francis at a tea house in Insadong, which is a neighborhood in Seoul, more than 20 years ago, and still remember his stories of how students organized during the last martial law of Chundu-hwan, including tearing pages from inside their physics textbooks and inserting flyers about the democratic uprising in Gwangju. Francis will provide context for how the far right seized power, how pro-democracy forces fought back, and although they succeeded in this round to impeach Yoon, the challenges that pro-democracy forces, including the Democratic Party and civil society activists, face to counter the rise of the far right. Then we will hear from Wol-Sun Lim, the strategy and policy coordinator at the International Transport Workers Federation. ITF is a democratic, affiliate-led global union federation representing the voice of transport workers at the International Labor Organization. It is composed of 700 affiliated trade unions from 153 countries and nearly 20 million members across the world. Wol-Sun will share how labor, as a major mobilizing force, played a central role in the protests demanding Yoon's impeachment. She will share how labor used a call for a national strike right after the martial law declaration and the call for, quote, worker-centered democracy and culture shifts that enabled greater solidarity with other movements such as LGBT groups. And last but not least, to understand how the far-right forces are transnational and the need for US progressive movements to understand this, we will hear from Kap Sol, a journalist based in New York. His writings have appeared in Labor Notes, in These Times, Business Insider, and other publications. Kap-Soo will talk about the confluence of 3 far-right forces, the MAGA church, small business owners, and young men, and how they formed a MAGA base in South Korea. Francis, Wol-Sun, and Kap will each speak for approximately 12 minutes, followed by Q&A. So please remember to post your questions in the Q&A, and I'll field them at the end of their presentations. So without further ado, we'll start with Francis.
Thank you, Anne, and also thank you, Corey, for organizing this webinar. I'll be very happy to speak with Kapsu and Wolsan. I will start from the night of December the 3rd, on the day of declaring martial law. Yes, I got text messages. I turned on TV. I was surprised. I couldn't believe it. It was real. Then I began to search for other media and SNS, and it was real. It took about 5 minutes to realize that this was a martial law. And then, as Christine mentioned, that I was a student during the last martial law period, student uprising, killings in Gwangju. I was a student. So immediately that memory of 1980 and military coming to the streets and shooting young people, protesters, that memory came back. And I was kind of traumatized and shocked. I couldn't move, couldn't think. But then the next image was people being bleeding and being killed, and the images of Gwangju. Many people were chopped off by our own military. So I couldn't just sit still. So I decided to go, and as much as I can do, I wanted to save people. That's why I rushed to the National Assembly about 30 minutes after the declaration of martial law. First, the surprise. The taxi that took me, the taxi dropped me off very close to the National Assembly building. That was a surprise because I was expecting the National Assembly surrounded by soldiers and tanks and so forth. It was not. So I felt something was wrong, and this martial law is not going as I remembered in 1980. And then people began to came in, the same kind of people like me who were alarmed and who wanted to stop the military and who wanted to save lives. And they tried to let the parliamentaries into the National Assembly. That was a crucial moment that the military was not so efficiently mobilized and so efficiently blocking the National Assembly, and protesters were mobilized so fast that the parliamentarians were able to enter into the National Assembly hall to pass the law to repeal the martial law. I think that was a very crucial moment. The second strange moment came when the military helicopters, dozens of them, flew over the sky to the National Assembly, and they came like 50 minutes later than the declaration of martial law. This was for me very strange. The core body of martial law troops is the special forces trained to subdue the forces, anti-forces. And they came so late, and their movement was very clumsy. So there was a second sense that these guys are not so ready or committed to suppress people and to push for the martial law. And then there was a lady protester just next to me, and she collapsed. She had a breakdown, seeing the helicopters and listening to the helicopters. So I realized that she is about the same age as I was, and she probably, this Gwangju trauma, the massacre trauma of 1980, that swept her and she collapsed. So this is how many people who have experienced Gwangju, who experienced our struggles against the military in 1980s, have reacted on the day. And I think that was a crucial moment. And also we have to salute to the parliamentarians, National Assembly members of the Democratic Party, who were able to rush into the hall and pass the law to repeal. And that was the second most crucial point. So all in all, this martial law, later we found out it has been very long planned. It was very carefully planned but it was ill carried out. So we have evidences that the President Yoon and his group were planning for martial law as early as from March 2023, and all the major cabinet members and military leaders were involved: Ministry of Defense, security advisors, frontline armored units, Joint Chief of Staff of Army, and Intelligence Command, Anti-Espionage Command, etc. So that tells us another story. Even though we had a successful institutional democratization, reforming the democracy to the principles of reforming the military to the principles of democracy is a very difficult task. And the top leadership, major sections of the top leadership, remained anti-democratic in the democratic institutionalization. So that's the partial failure and limitation of the democratization process we have seen in South Korea since 1987. So these were the core forces, and they colluded with President Yoon's far-right messages and ideologies. And another important point comes from the fact that Korea is deeply divided, not only nationally, but politically. So this martial law plot included uh, doing offensives to DPRK, North Korea, so that DPRK can attack back to South. And this will justify the martial law. And this was a carefully planning. They had a mobilization plan, they had an offensive plan. They actually sent military drones to Pyongyang, just above the headquarters of Kim Jong-un. And they also had a careful plan to pick up and kill leaders of political parties, leaders of religion, and leaders of labor union, journalists, and civil societies. So one of my key points is that the martial law has been planned carefully for a long time, but our democratic institutions have failed to detect it and prevent it. And that's the outcome of the declaration of martial December the 3rd. But because of quick mobilization of the democratic citizens, trade unions, and organized people, and the quick actions by Democratic Party, the martial law was able to stop. So this was a really historical juncture point from December to now this year. And also, I think it has an international implication, which I'd like to highlight. If you remember the foreign policy of Biden administration, Yoon Suk-yeol was very much in support of that. And the core values of this foreign policy is that free democratic countries come together to exercise a democratic domination. So it's a freedom and democratic value-centered foreign policy. And one of the Biden's favored little ally, President Yoon of South Korea, betrayed that value-oriented democratic domination by staging martial law. I think this is symbolic, and this is representative of the inner contradiction, the inner hypocrisy of the value-oriented foreign policy of the US and its allies, the dream of democratic domination of the free world. This shows the hypocrisy and contradiction hidden in that foreign policy. In other words, I think Yoon's coup d'etat also symbolizes the failure, the nostalgic failure, or failure of nostalgic democratic domination pushed by the Democrats of the US. So this is also very symbolic. And then what made President Yoon and the martial law first? As I mentioned, there was insufficient democratization, especially in terms of democratization of the military and security sectors, intelligence sectors. We have big loopholes, and the president still holds too much power to exercise the authority of martial law. if without grounds. So that's the first point. And the second point, we have to observe the ruling party, the former ruling party. The name is People's Power Party. Usually, our conservative ruling party was based on conservative political ideas. So we were safe to say that these are conservative parties and the opposition is democratic parties. But now the conservative parties, I think they betrayed the name of conservatism because this martial law and all the activities of martial forces, they were against the Constitution. The behavior and the decisions made by President Yoon was against the Constitution. So we are now witnessing the transformation of traditional conservatism in South Korea, turning into anti-constitutional new extremism. And I think the right name is that the rise of the far-right political forces. It's not just on the streets. The ruling party actively supported the extreme far-right messages and ideologies and activities on the street in support of Yoon. And I think this also has an international dimension. As you see in the media, the demonstrations by far-right groups and fundamental Christians come together. The flags they wave are the first American flags and the South Korean flags, and very often Israeli flags. I think all these three flags have meaning. Israel means that for the prosperity of Israel, you can kill and massacre people of Palestine and whatever. So denial of democracy for the benefit of the national patriotic prosperity. So that's the symbolism of Israeli flag. The American flag and the MAGA, red MAGA caps worn by these far-right demonstrators in South Korea, it symbolizes the influence of Trumpism in South Korea, similar to many other parts of the court. So these pro-coup demonstrators, they actively expressed their ideology that we are with the Trump, we are with MAGA, and we are with massacring people in Palestine, etc. So this is more than conservatism. This is more than reactionary. And I would say that this year is also a historical juncture that far-right politics are being materialized with the support of the ruling party and very active instigation and financial support from the fundamental Christians in South Korea. And I'm sure Kapsu will describe how the fundamental Christian right wings are connected with the US influence. And then my final point is about this far-right political forces. Yes, they are racist because they used very strong anti-Chinese discourses. Yes, they are non-democratic because they supported martial law and they deny the values of constitution and they deny the authority of constitutional court. And how large are they? So recently, the military coup and martial law served as a new criteria of self-identification of the right-wing forces. So several surveys demonstrate that about 20% of the people supported Yoon's coup d'etat continuously. It's interesting to learn that at the beginning of the martial law, about 80% of the South Koreans were against the martial law. Now, this ratio, 80%, decreases gradually but steadily over to between 50 and 60%. And then the public polls for the support of the coup increases gradually as the demonstrators, pro-Yoon demonstrators, grew larger and larger on the streets. So the best estimates I get from the public surveys is that between 13% to 20% maximum, they abide by the principles of far-right ideology, that democracy is not functional, maybe authoritarianism and dictatorship may bring more prosperity for South Korea. China is something that we have to defeat, and it's a racist approach to Chinese influence, but this approach stops for the influence of Trumpism and from the US. And then we can use physical force to suppress democratic forces. So these are core values of the new right-wing protesters. And my point is that it is growing. It is growing. And unlike the last impeachment of President Park Geun-hye, the successful impeachment, this time I see more and more, lots of more young people on the streets. They are not yet strongly organized into the political party or into their own organization, but they are beginning to organize. And the ideological level and the discourses and the methodologies they use in the protest, they are becoming more sophisticated. And I haven't seen this in the previous impeachment rallies. So this joining of the young people, it's not large yet. It's not large yet. But when disenchanted, disappointed young generations begin to organize and join into right-wing forces, that will be another turning point for the course of democracy in South Korea. So I hesitate to use that we have won the case of impeachment. It's the victory discourse. I hesitate to use the victory discourses. I think the democratic forces on the streets and in the parliament, we are not yet there to declare victory over military coup forces or the right-wing forces. The struggle and the contest, what kind of country this should be, especially what kind of society for everybody this society should be. This contest is going on, and I'm afraid much more violent, in much more violent form, and in much more, how to say, organized, clashing way from now on. So we are now on that unfinished journey. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francis. Your presentation was unbelievable and so spot on about the situation that took place in South Korea. And as I was listening to so much of your insight, it resonated so much with what I think what we're seeing here in the United States. So there's a really good question in the Q&A, but we'll turn to it afterwards. But please, others, throw your questions into the Q&A and we'll have a really fruitful dialogue afterwards. So now we will turn to Wolsan, who will share her insights on the key role of labor.
Okay, thank you, Christine, and everyone, and thank you, Francis, Taehun. That was really, really helpful and a very astute analysis. I guess I should introduce myself a little bit more to start. So I am currently working for a global union federation, but still based in Korea. The Korean Public Service and Transport Workers Union, which is the largest affiliate of the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions, which is like the AFL-CIO of Korea, sort of, is an affiliate also of the global union that I'm now working for. So I've come from working for the largest industrial union in Korea for over a decade, to now being in its global parent federation, but I'm still based out of that office and here in Korea, and also sort of have close personal and work ties to the movement. So I will try to speak as an insider, more or less, of the Korean labor movement. And as I do that, I will try as much as possible to kind of make a comparison to the American labor movement and kind of conditions in the US and where there might be some similarities, but also where there are a lot of differences, because I think you need to have that kind of basis to be able to draw any comparisons or lessons, which is always not as easy as we think it's going to be. So to start, probably, I guess where there are kind of structural similarities between the two societies that will make the situation look quite kind of similar right now is first, I think if you look at government structure, the centralization of power in the hands of the executive, which gets called an imperial presidency, a form of imperial presidency is similar, and why one of the reasons in which you could say that democracy is one of the ways in which democracy is incomplete in both countries and allows for or kind of makes it possible for this kind of centralization this kind of excess of the executive. Although I think, as Francis said, most people did not see this coming, and so there's worth looking a little bit more at Yoon and the people around him as to why they chose martial law in this situation. But clearly, we also see a grab of executive power going on in the U.S. and the connection then between the people in political power and the far right and the Christian base of the far right is also something that's quite similar between the two countries. Of course, then there are a lot of differences, including the place in the world economic system of the two countries, but there is a shared neo-colonial and colonial past. So that forms some of the context. Just in terms of the labor movement, and I think understanding the history of the Korean labor movement is important to understand the role that we have played in this particular movement moment, and also in past uprisings against, that have led to impeachment of Park Geun-hye in 2016-17, but also similar moments in the past, which is that there are two national centers, or sort of if there's what you call a national center, the AFL-CIO is the national center of the United States, but there's two national centers in Korea. The Federation of Korean Trade Unions has its roots in a government-controlled labor unions. And after the 1987 democratization movement, this sparked what is called here the democratization of the labor movement. And so if that took place in 1987 June, then July, August, September were massive outpouring of movement to democratize the workplace through the construction of labor unions that were outside the government-controlled national center. And then, that's the origins of the KCTU. And so the KCTU has in its DNA and its roots the fight for democratization and a fight against dictatorship. And that led to, after formal democratization and the eventual formation of the KCTU, two goals, which were aimed at building the power of the working class, both industrially and then also politically. The first one is to build industrial trade unions. Why do we build industrial trade unions? Because they can mobilize well, right? For other reasons too, they can organize precarious workers, they can bargain across the industry, but also they can mobilize well, and they're centralized. And then the second, it was to build a political party, a workers' party. So we could talk about how well those things have gone on, but nonetheless, the Korean labor movement now has a structure that, well, it may not be as good as other labor movements at doing certain things. For example, bargaining on an industrial level, it does mobilize very well, and the unions have structures that allow for that, as well as the country being small, so it makes it easy to get a lot of people to one place at the same time. So that's a little bit of background. just in terms of how, so I think it's interesting to talk about what happened on the night of December 3rd, just from a personal experience. I think my experience also kind of gives you a little bit of an insider view into the labor movement. So my partner is staff for KPTU, the union that I also worked for, and now I'm in the parent federation. We were sitting on the couch, around 10 o'clock at night watching TV. And then these news flashes came up. It came up as like BBC on my phone is almost as quickly as it came up as Korean news. And the first thing we said, is this a joke? And then it started to look serious. And then we started to wait for the directive to come on our phones, which happens. And so we saw that KCTU has put out a directive, but KPTU has not yet put out a directive to come to the National Assembly. So we were late because we were waiting for the directive from KPTU. So the first thing that KCTU did, which was a very good thing to do and continued to do through this process, was to send out what are called directives here to come to the National Assembly to fight against the forces that are, or to come together with citizens who are standing off with the forces there to allow the Democratic National Assembly members to get in to vote down martial law. And so that's one of the powers that KCTU has, is to quickly mobilize the structure of the industrial unions and the staff, and then down to the membership and the local unions to come. But yes, our union was a little bit late to get ours out, so we got there a little bit late. And that's also because we're very used to following directives, because that's what we're trained to do. So we waited for the directive to come out. But that I think that's kind of an entry point into the role of the trade unions, Korean Confederation of Trade Unions. I should say that it took a little while, but the FKTU, the other National Assembly, National Center, which has reformed itself somewhat since democratization, and in recent years also eventually did come out against. I mean, I think it took a day or two, but came out and called for protest action against martial law and for Yoon's impeachment. So that's how clearly undemocratic and inappropriate the martial law and Yoon's actions were. So in many ways, the role that I'll talk about mostly the KCTU, however, the KCTU played in this round of mass protest was quite similar in some ways to the mass mobilizations that led to the impeachment of Park Geun-hye in 2016. I think we learn as we do these things, so that some things have evolved, but trade unions are still, and will probably be for a long time, the largest and most well-organized mass force in Korean society. So farmers also organize. There are women's organizations. There are student organizations. Many of these have been very weakened in recent years. And we can talk about whether the Korean labor movement is getting stronger or weaker, but nonetheless, it is definitely the largest organized force. And so, and as I said, has a structure for mass protest. And so that is a big role that Korean labor movements played. And so, and Christine talked about the many, many protests that happened, large protests on the weekends, smaller ones during the week. And so the trade unions, in addition to calling their members out to those protests, also, particularly in the beginning, so if I talk about KPTU, for example, called for protests that tied together the issues of democracy and calling for Yoon's impeachment together with labor issues that would happen before the main protests, in order to bring members out, and then also to hold the space and open up the space for protesters to come in. And that, I think there were some symbolic moments where, particularly, I think it was the first weekend after martial law was declared, where the president of KCTU came out and said to the members, come, and there were police sort of blocking the area in the front of the National Assembly, and a mass of union members walked out, and the police were not going to stand off at that point. But anyway, symbolically opened to the space, and I think that's the role that KCTU has been trying to play and will continue to try to play, although it will become more difficult under a Democratic presidency. And so that's one thing. You mentioned in your opening, Christine, the declaration of a general strike. There were the rail union, which is part of KPTU, was on strike as uh, when martial law was declared, and continued to strike for a few days after the beginning of these protests. In 2016, the rail strike that was going on was a main mobilizing force and went on for, I think, 72 days. And so really played a big role. And we wanted the rail union to do that. But there are dynamics within strikes, which is that you have negotiations around workplace issues. And if you settle them, you stop striking, right? So um, after the declaration of general strike, some unions that did have the legal right to strike struck. The metal workers struck for a few hours here and there, but mostly those declarations of general strike are symbolic. And we end up bringing members out in any way we can at that time. And so I think I actually prefer not to focus on those things. I think that there's a certain inertia around the way we do things. Is anytime something big happens, we feel like we must declare a general strike, even if in fact we're not in the position to mobilize one. So rather than, I mean, I think, those declarations have happened, but rather than focusing on that, I think focusing on the many ways in which KCTU had tried and succeeded to mobilize members, both to come out as organized forces, but also to come out as citizens with their families. Another role I think that's important that the KCTU has been playing is participating in one of the main coalitions, the one that is a little bit less controlled by the Democratic Party, which is called, I have it here in Korean, but I didn't translate it, but something like Emergency Action for the Impeachment of Yoon Sung-yeol and the reformation of society, the Great Reformation of society. And in addition to organizing protests, that coalition, which brings together thousands of civil society organizations and mass organizations, has been having a debate about what are the main issues that we want to put forward in the new elections. And so as early elections come up, and what can we do to not just get rid of Yoon, but then also work for a more democratic society, work for the rights of uh, different minority people in society, work for labor rights, these kinds of things. And then I'll stop because I know this is going on longer than I expected. The last thing I would say is that, and you asked me to talk about, was that I think KCTU and the trade unions put a lot of effort into try to building a culture within the protests that brought together the more traditional militancy of the labor movement and a more popular culture, and one that was open to queer people and young people and migrant workers. And I think it would be good to have a discussion about how that was done and why that was a little different this time than in previous protests. But I know I'm going on too long, so I will stop there and we can come back in the question and answer.
Thank you so much, Bolsan. I think that's a really important point that we should return back to, because in kind of watching the protests and and even Kapsu, who is our next speaker, he said that one of his friends who's what this term is, like ajushi, sort of a middle-aged man, he said he would go to the protests and he didn't even know a lot of, oftentimes these are like the traditional movement songs. And that, he didn't know a lot of these like K-pop songs because they're like led by young women and younger generations. So I think that's also a challenge for all of us about how we build these intergenerational movements that feel inclusive, but also that is building something that could really be powerful to challenge the threat to all of our democracies that we're witnessing. So I know we are running late, and I want to make sure we have ample time for the Q&A, because there are some excellent questions that I know that we would all love to hear the speakers address. So Kapsu, I'll hand it off to you to bring it home, round out the conversation about the transnational far right and how we need to understand that perspective, especially here, most of us listening from the US. So Kapsu. And then you may have to lean back again because we're just seeing your neck. We'd like to see your whole face if it's possible. Thank you.
See the screen?
Netfa, we might need a little help. There we go.
Yes, okay. My name is Kapsor. Thank you for having me today. And it's hard to, there's so great, it's tough act to follow, but I try my best. I'm going to talk about the rise of far right in South Korea. Actually, in the past 4 months, rise of far right caught many Korean surprise and off guard, because on your left top, that's the far right demonstration 8 years ago against impeachment of Park Geun-hye, which is briefly mentioned in the earlier presentation. That's on the bottom. This is the anti-impeachment protest this year. As you can see, the first picture, the protest consists of a retiree, old man and woman, disorganized. But look at this. These are all young people in their 30, 20 to 40, well organized. Then they use the slogan they borrowed from MAGA movement to stop the steal. So what happened here? So crucial moment, and they become violent too. In January, some of the young demonstrators raided the courthouse, ransacked the courthouse after one judge extended detention of Yoon Yeol on that day. It's like a scene is more like a January 6th Capitol Hill raid in 4 years ago, after the first Trump administration. Actually, I think they are partly inspired by MAGA movement of that raid too. So there are 3 factors that give rise to far right in South Korea. First is conservative mega church. Middle class, second is middle class frustration. Finally, the discontent young males. These are South Korean mega church. And in one picture, South Korea is home to 3 mega churches of the world: the Presbyterian, Baptist, and Full Gospel Church. That's the homegrown church in South Korea. They have tens of thousands parishioners in each church, and they have good connection with the high praise and low praise of South Korean society. All began in 1973 when the Bill Graham organized hosted 7 days of Easter service in South Korea. It was the center of South Korea. It lasted 7 days. There are at least 1 million people gathered each day in that day. And this is the largest rally Bill Graham held in his life. There was South Korea in 1973. And this rally became possible thanks to Park Chung-hee, the dictator of that time, because he wanted to curb rise of labor ministry back then. The church back then in 1970, kind of small and very radical and liberal back then. But after this rally, narrative and the structure of South Korean Christianity have changed. It became more conservative. It became bigger. It was a time when these mega churches began to emerge. Now, mega churches have some problem because of South Korea have a shrinking and aging population. They shrink their congregation. So they begin to look to bigotry idea like homophobia, sexism, anti-labor, xenophobia kind of stuff to hold tight their segregation. In the past, I think since 1995 or 2000. So there's the frustration among the middle class. Retirement in South Korea means you become a small business owner because there's no national pension system until after 1988. So many baby boomers born after Korean War should open their own business after retirement. The 20% of economically active populations are small business owners in South Korea. That's the largest in OECD. And now, after some economic jittery and the depression, COVID and so on, 40% of them are in default on loan of totaling $21 billion. Not the one, it's $21 billion. In that case, this small owner used to be a supporter of a liberal party, Democratic Party. Now some of them begin to look to far right because they want to see stability and the order instead of a radical change. These three reports made, then finally these young people, but 54% of South Korean aged 25 to 35 are college graduated. South Koreans are very well educated population. That's the highest ratio among OECD again. And the 13% of male in this age group is economically inactive. That means that they stop looking for job and they don't do anything. They stay home preparing for some test or playing game all day. These young people become a full soldier of the far right in this winter. Now the far right movement led by two pastors. This is Jung Kwang-hoon. His church is kind of a cult, but Jung Kwang-hoon's problem is that he turned his rally into money-making machine. He sell credit card account, cell phone friend, subscription to his paper at the rally, made a lot of money along the way. The other guy is Son Hyun-bo, is a Baptist pastor based in Busan, the second largest city of Korea. He's much more political and stoic. His rally drew many young people these days, and the mega church and the politicians began to support him financially and otherwise. Am I going too fast?
No, sounds good. Keep going.
And unlike previous right-wing movement in South Korea, this movement have a strong connection with the US MAGA. This is Annie Chen, the arch enemy of Christine An. She founded the KCPAC 2019, model after CPAC of USA. KCPAC has its office in US and Seoul. And this guy is Chirac, is Matt Chirac, the chairman of American Conservative Union. He's the first and the only American who met Yoon Suk-yeol after the coup. And he said, he quote Yoon Suk-yeol as saying, Chinese tech firm Huawei runs South Korean election. That means basically that's the part of a big conspiracy theory in South Korea. South Korean election commission use Huawei made server, so Chinese can manipulate and leak the election through Huawei server. And actually, I'm not sure you actually say or not to this guy, but he called Yoon as saying at the one of the meeting. That's the capture of that meeting. This is Chirac, and this is Golden Chan, the famous anti-China hawk. He basically parroted what South Korean far right say throughout the CPAC this year. This young man is Kim Jong-un, is kind of a sidekick of Annie Chen. One of the things he did in the past 6 months was that he tried to form a paramilitary group against pro-democratic protesters. He was at the CPAC and spread Annie Chen's literature. So this is so unlike previous movements, South Korea far right today has close international connection. They would not go away anytime soon. At the same time, they are now part of Conservative People's Power Party, Yoon Suk-yeol's party. And I would not surprise that if they launch their own party in the next election cycle, or something like Vox in Spain or alternate for Germany in Germany. So this is a big problem. South Korea has never ever faced situation like this, in which non-government sponsors, purely civilian far-right movements take hold. That's it.
Thank you, Kapsu. Is that it? I
Yeah.
mean, it's a lot.
Okay.
Thank
So-
you for that presentation. We're going to now turn to Q&As. There's some really excellent questions in the Q&A that I wanted to ask, but as I start to kind of summarize them in the given that we have limited time, I wanted to just maybe first ask to our speakers two quick questions. One is, what happens next? We know that Yoon is still facing criminal charges, but as he wears the Make Korea Great Again, and his followers have all pledged Yoon forever, as he left presidential grounds. We've seen now how authoritarian leaders like Bolsonaro in Brazil rejected President Lula Silva's electoral win, alleging election fraud and foreign interference, which the South Korean far right is also now kind of preaching about the interference of China. And now that protests demanding Yoon's impeachment have ended, like, I guess it's kind of a two-part question. One is, how will progressives like harness all this kind of anti-Yoon and calls for the court to impeach and ouster Yoon? How will progressives channel that energy to make sure that there is a decisive win for a pro-democracy liberal candidate? And then what plans are being put into place right now to ensure that whatever decision is made is not basically challenged through violence, as we saw with the January 6th style attack in the US? So that's the first question. So I don't know who wants to start, but what happens next? Francis, I see you starting to.
Well, I guess there is a certain pressure from Christine to speak, for me to speak first. Okay. I think the Democratic Party is now going very fast for the electoral politics, and they want to, the primary goal is to win by substantial votes to stabilize the politics. And because Korea is politically and ideologically very deeply divided, and it's getting more divided after the impeachment. So they will try to secure a safe win for Lee Jae-myung, and that means, and they declared that Democratic Party will turn to the right. They say they turn to the middle, but they will have to turn to the right. It is already not a progressive party, or not fully, how to say, free from conservatism, but meaning that turning to the right or turning to the middle means that it will embrace more traditional conservative policies, and especially with the US, they are in the position of defending the a tariff war. So and it's a unequal ally to the US. So therefore, they face a very difficult bargaining position. So will be defensive. That means they will be more submissive to the US pressure. That also means, in addition to turning to the right, in terms of foreign policy and in terms of handling security and military affairs on its own. So that's a very difficult part. And as Wolsan mentioned in our previous discussion, the power balance between the Democratic Party and the social movements is not equal. And also in the public, there is more and more distrust against the civil society actors, whether they are for the public good or for the self-interest. The public reception of civil society contribution for democracy and social justice is waning, and in my standard, waning very fast. So, after 30 years of vibrating civil society, there is another reaction from the public coming in, questioning the role of the civil society in South Korea. This is a kind of energy for the rise of the right wing at the same time. So I will not expect a definite win on the democratic forces, but it'll be a step forward if the Democratic Party wins the presidential election. And at the same time, the trade unions and social organizations are putting forward for the real social reform agenda. Many of the social and cultural and social welfare agenda are likely to be taken by the Democratic Party, but more radical ones, and especially on tax issues, equality in taxation and foreign policy, it'll be a very, very slow change, if not no change. So I don't see a very bright future through the election. I only see a step forward. And another grim aspect is that, in my view, South Korean society in general and the social movements in particular, in my view, we don't have a clear plan strategy to lessen the influence of the right wing, the rise of the right wing. We don't have a clear approach to that. We don't know yet how to win the mind of the public that we need to dissociate with the right wing and fundamental Christians and all these connections with the US and South Korea for extremism. We don't have a clear path forward, and this is very worrisome to me.
Actually, Western
So,
and a little bit talk about the left-wing candidate, debate about left-wing candidate in South Korea.
You want me to go first?
I
Okay.
mean, I
Yeah.
don't know about it, but you should know something about it.
Yeah, no, did you say you do know about it? I can, but you can also go ahead. Okay, I'll say a few things, including about efforts for political involvement in the elections on the left. But I think the first thing I wanted to say, though, is what should happen. What would be, from the perspective of the left or the labor movement, what should happen? What I would like to say, I mean, I think that Lee Jae-myung will win the elections but as Francis said, he's already, they say, right click or stepping to the right, and that is something that we're going to have to contend with. Ideally, the left, including labor and civil society in alliance with other social forces, would be able to build enough unity and sophistication to intervene in the next elections or not in the next elections, but in the elections and then after the elections under the next administration, to strengthen public debate around more fundamental issues, including constitutional reform, tax issues also, and I won't get into how, but a fundamental restructuring of a very split labor market and very fractured supply chains in order to create more equality and better jobs, to sort of create a just transition away from this high dependency on small businesses, which is part of the foot soldiers, right? The foot soldiers of the far right. And to do that would be to get beyond, we're just mobilizing and we're just in the streets, and to have real political debate and a more unified strategy and a more sophisticated strategy. Do I think that will happen? Unfortunately, I think we're not there yet. And from labor, what will be interesting, on the one hand, you will probably see what we do well, which is mass mobilizations, which may create some sort of tension with the Democratic Party. But then on the other hand, not being able to build that alliance and also not being able to have a real alternative political party, so that in the end, we're going to play into the hands of the Democratic Party. That is usually what happens. So just in terms, but there are efforts. And as I said, from the perspective of the labor movement, the two goals of the KCT when it was formed, one was industrial unionism, the other was build a political party. That was the Democratic Labor Party until it broke apart in around sort of, in the late 2000s. And now, unfortunately, we don't have a unified political strategy within the labor movement or on the left. And so you see a broad, a lot of very small left political parties which have lost power basically to the Democratic Party and the Chogo-Kyakshin-dang, which we won't talk about, but anyway, sort of an arm of the Democratic Party, sort of, in the last period. But there are political candidates on the left. So the Progressive Party has a candidate for presidency. I do not think she's the head of the party. I do not think she will probably end up kind of falling out and giving support to the Democratic Party, but let's see. And then just yesterday, so other forces representing different elements of the left, maybe more Marxist left, and also the vestiges of the Justice Party, which was sort of like a social democratic party, which lost all of its National Assembly members in the last central election. They've come together in a democratic, what do you call it, in a elections front. So they're doing their own primary between a very good labor lawyer and also the former president of the KCTU, who was in the leadership under Park Geun-hye. In that they'll have their own candidate. And the goal of that is obviously not to win the presidency, but to try to build that alliance around a more radical reform agenda. And I think that is at least important because ultimately the rise of the far-right is grounded in the structure of the incomplete democracy and then the structure of the economy, right? And so if we don't have fundamental transformation of those things, we're going to always see what we've seen in the past, which was Park Geun-hye, Moon Jae-in came in for a little while, nothing worked, and then we got, the rise of Yoon, and now we have this coming together with the far-right. Domestically and globally. And so that fundamental transformation is important, and we have to keep trying, even though the main obstacle, I think, to it is the ideological divisions, even within the left, and the factionalism within the left. So a mouthful.
Sue, did you want to chime in?
Oh, yes, I think the coup, Yoon's coup Yoon's coup represent crisis of an official party in South Korea, not just liberal, not just conservative, entire crisis of entire political establishment, just like Trump represents the crisis of the US party across the spectrum. And the problem with the South Korean progressive and left is that I guess they did not want to make a break with the Democratic Party. Just like in this country, we kind of afraid make a break with the Democratic Party in US. So I think it's very important to have a organization or many organizations that can act independently of a liberal Democratic Party in US and the US and South Korea as well. Lee Jae-myung is very interesting personality. I think he's one of the most conservative candidates South Korea have seen the past 30 years. I mean, South Korea's legislature, National Assembly, has been paralyzed for many years because of a standoff between PPP and the DP. But they agreed to pass several pieces of legislation that all benefit big businesses. For example, they pass new estate tax that benefit upper 10% of the population. They pass financial transaction regulation that benefit upper 3.3% of investors. That's what they represent for.
Okay, those are some really kind of sobering bits of information, but I think very critical for all of us that are watching and listening, and especially from the US, because I think we're also facing very similar consequences of not having a real opposition party that could challenge the kind of rapid erosion of democracy that we're witnessing. I'm going to take the next few minutes to maybe go through a little bit more systematically the questions. There were excellent questions. Thank you all for typing those in. And I would say the first round of questions has to do with the coup and the kind of swift response by the lawmakers and the citizens. And obviously, South Korea is vastly different from the United States, especially in terms of the massive geography. And so the first question is, about the hesitancy of the military and the poor execution of following the orders around the martial law. A few questions. One is, what if instead of deploying the military that Yoon deployed, the far right, especially the youth vigilantes, like how would that have played out? So I guess maybe that's the first question with regards to the coup and then the attempted coup and the swiftness of the way in which civil society and the opposition party mobilized. What kind of advice would you give to us in the United States, where we are so far stretched out? And then another person, Betsy, raised a really good question, which is Trump has been signaling that he may use the Insurrection Act, that he may deploy troops to the border, which wouldn't just be the border, but would be possibly nationwide. And, what advice do you have for those of us that may be experiencing a similar situation in South Korea? And, I think also the unanimous decision of the Supreme Court in South Korea, the Constitutional Court, to vote 8-0 to uphold the impeachment signaled the kind of rationality of the courts. And, we are seeing some of the federal judges now voting, and even the Supreme Court voted for unanimously for facilitating the return of a permanent resident that was sent to El Salvador. So illegally sent. So, what do we do in the face of resistance largely being dependent on litigation to kind of fight back the tide of declining and rapidly deteriorating democracy? So whoever wants to go first. I know, they're like, nobody. Francis, do you want to kick us off?
Okay, I think first, President Yoon could not have mobilized the young people for his coup attempt. First, because he comes from legal background. He's a prosecutor, and he was very proud to be a president, authoritarian president. So he tried to mobilize the state machinery to stage the coup. And the second point is the young people were not that physically organized into radical actions at that moment. The young people are being mobilized and organized and getting the taste of funding from mega churches and into their organization, etc., through pro-Yoon campaigns since last December. So they are being formed in the process of impeachment debate. So at the point of December last year, Yoon could not have organized a successful, physically active young force. That's the point. And I feel utterly incapable of thinking of, advices to reform the politics in the US. I feel utterly impossible to do that. Just one point, Trumpism clearly has a global impact and is a great encouragement to the right of the far right forces around the world. So in that sense, the pro-democracy and pro-people people in the US and around the world should take this not as a Trumpism issue, but it's a global transformational issue. I think it is very difficult for the Americans to fight against Trump on the Americans alone, because actually what I see is that Trump is trying to preserve the survival and interest of US imperialism in the best interest of the American people who believe in American unique status as an imperial country. So he is, in his own right, doing the best to protect the interest of the US. So it's very difficult to create something beyond the Trumpism from within the US movements, I think. That's my understanding. But it has a very strong outreach. And I think South Korea will be one of the first countries, one of the top countries being very much influenced by Trumpism into domestic politics.
Well, Son, do you have anything you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I had better things to say, but I mean, so I was actually in the US recently, but even if I hadn't been there, I think the situation in the US is much more scary than it is in Korea. I mean, I am really scared, and I think that you know, what's coming through very strongly here is that this was a mobilizing moment in a small way for, if I think from a labor perspective, for labor to come together and be more accepted and more accepting of different social forces within this space of protest bubbles that were at most 1 million people. And that really actually has not come outside that bubble. And so it was a small mobilizing and a small coming together, and we are having these debates, right? But it was a much bigger mobilizing moment, as Francis just explained, for the right and to young people, for young people, both speakers explained, to come into that movement. And so this is clearly a force that is a problem and will continue to be a problem in South Korean society and also in the US, and there's a connection and it's global. But in the US, you know, the Democratic Party had a majority in the National Assembly here when martial law was declared. The country is much smaller. There are these mobilization structures, which even if the US was a smaller country, the DNA of the US left and the US labor movement, which I was going to talk about, which I didn't do, is very, very different from South Korea. And so you can't just say, oh, but you should build big coalitions, have these debates, get yourself in order so that you can mobilize quickly, because actually this is a product of a historical development in Korea that has happened in a different way. And so I think that the US and I have been speaking to my friends and colleagues in the US left, and we have the same conversation, which is just to talk about what, you know, everything that's on the front of the New York Times and be horrified by it. And I really don't like those conversations, actually, because they are not going in. But I feel like there's some collective, like, what do we do? But I guess what I can say is, what are the strengths of the US left, if I look at it from a Korean perspective? So, you know, there is like stronger anti-racism mobilization, and there's, you know, the experience of Black Lives Matters, good and bad, and there's the experience of the climate movement. And so where are there seeds of strength in the US, and how can you build on them, is the only thing I can say right now. But that, yeah, those conversations, and I would actually really love to hear from, because I assume that people in the audience are in those spaces that are having those conversations. So I would really love to hear about what conversations you are having about coalition building and preparing yourselves. And I think in that dialogue, and so maybe this is another event, which is not a webinar, but a Zoom meeting, right? Where that dialogue is probably where we could start to find some answers to this. But I do take away from the conversation this, that there is a moment to have global discussions about, the rise of the right and how we build an alliance around it, being wary that the same thing in both countries. In Korea, I think going forward, there will be a debate about fundamental reform versus a broad front against the right. And the broad front against the right will fall behind the Democratic Party, and that will not work. And so that would be one of the questions I think that we probably have to talk about with colleagues in the US and then globally as well.
I see we have just 5 more minutes or 4 more minutes before the end of the webinar. And I'm going to try my best to frame a question that I think kind of captures a lot of the kind of disparate questions. And one is about the very thing that you just said, Wolsan, which is like, where is our strength? And I think one thing that we have witnessed in the last several weeks was we saw the hands-off mass mobilization. They say over 3 million people, 1,300 protests were organized nationally and in the US. And we also have seen, I think the remembering about the majority of American people stand for goodness, they stand for justice, they stand for equality. But the kind of seizure of a minority of people that have used all sorts of tactics. And one, Sanho raises this question, which I think we're all facing too, which is the massive disinformation. He points to how is it true that half of the South Koreans are getting their news via YouTube, and think about the various like disinformation and the use of social media, especially by the tech oligarchy, to kind of yield a certain political outcome. And then we're seeing this, sorry, I'm trying to scroll to Phyllis's question, which is then you've seen like what kind of, and the difference that you point out, Wolsan, is that, when Yoon imposed martial law, you had a Democratic Party that actually was the majority, the opposition party that was the majority. Whereas like Trump has tripartite governing power because you have a majority of conservatives on the Supreme Court. You have obviously a majority of Republicans. Where are the places that we can try to, appeal to those that may have been aligned with Yoon, but that spoke out? And we saw that with the PPP, the head of the PPP, calling for his impeachment. So there's so many questions here, and I'm also like cognizant of the limitation of time, but I think that there were some, I guess the last thing is like, what can we do collectively? Because what we're facing in the US is similarly to what people in Brazil and all these other countries that have seen the rise of the far right. And, what can we do to try to have more understanding, more analysis, and more cross-transnational solidarity? Because as I see from the US side, so much of the weakness of a Democratic Party is its inability to go beyond just looking for solutions through a domestic frame, whether it's immigration, whether it's the global economy, whether it's climate change. These have transnational and global implications. And so hopefully this is the beginning, as you said, Wolsan, of more conversations among us that are seeing the limitations and the weaknesses and the fragility of our democratic systems. So I'm going to close by giving you guys the final word. Any kind of hopeful messages that you want to share with everybody who has been with us for the last 90 minutes about what we can do in this moment as we all face this rapid erosion of democracy. So Francis, I see you unmuted to kick us off.
Well, I'd like to thank IPS for organizing this session, and we should continue, whenever there is a hot topic from our society, we should continue this kind of discussion and debates with a more global perspective and global movement. And I think our discussion today also showed gave a hint for the path forward. We need to formulate some kind of common agenda or common doctrine of progressive movements, how to fight the new rise of the far right wing, which has some similarities of the 1930s in Europe, 1920s in the US, but which is fundamentally different. And this must have structural factors, and structural factors makes us unite to and develop common platform. I wish that gives a hint for a way forward for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Taehoon. Kapsu and Wolsan.
Yes, I think what set apart between South Korean and the US population is that South Koreans still understand democracy have to be won. It's not given. And the ways Americans responded to or reacted to, or lack of their reaction to Trumpism is scaring me. Not Trumpism itself, but the way we responded to Trump so far scare me. And yeah, South Korea is the first country that began to defeat Trumpism in recent memory. I mean, we all lost Europe, Latin America, but South Korea is the only country that at least began to do something against Trumpism fundamentally. And there is a old song called "Revolution Will Not Be Televised," but we are living a time even coup should be live streamed. The South Korean coup was live streamed over YouTube. I can see everything happen real time. So something like that happened in US. Be like a Korean. Get out and be on street.
You, Kapsu and Wolsan.
Yeah, thank you, Christine and IPS, and also to the two other speakers. I really learned a lot from our engagement and your presentations, and hope we can continue it. From the perspective of the labor movement, to be very honest, what I'm worried about here is that we will do what we always do. So we will do the same thing we did after Park Geun-hye into Moon Jae-in. We're actually saying pretty much the same things, and we're trying to put them forward with almost the same strategy, but actually we need new strategies, and we're also in a very, very different moment globally. I think I'm afraid that that is the case in a lot of places. And so maybe this is also the case in the United States, where we are really pulling our hair out about what's on the front of the screen in the news, but we are not experimenting with new formations. We are not recognizing the depth of the difference of the political economic moment that we're in. I don't think we understand it. And so I feel quite anxious about that. And this is the first time that I've felt, oh my God, I'm doing a Christine on. I never do this. This is actually the first time I feel like I've been part of a conversation that goes starting to go a little bit beyond the kind of the inertia. We use the word, it's a very fast inertia in Korea, but sort of saying the same things to ourselves with each other again and again, but like acting like they're different, and so I hope that there are new formations coming forward in the US, in Korea, and globally. And if there are people who have participated, who are part of them, and who can share that, I think that would be really, really helpful for all of us.
Thank you so much, Wolsan. I'm just going to close with saying that in a recent interview, The American economist Richard Wolff described how the US empire is in decline and questioned who will replace the US as it did with the British Empire in the 20th century. He says that the US and G7 allies, if you can call them that, even now, comprise roughly 12 to 15% of the world's peoples, whereas the BRICS 22 countries comprise 60% of the world's people. He said, quote, "The future is with them, not with us. Or we can imagine a very different future. We can imagine a world where economies are organized to benefit life and regenerate the earth. As this empire falls, new worlds can be born, embodying values that affirm the sacredness of life." So I think that that's what we're all trying to build towards. And so IPS is committed to playing that key role within the belly of the beast to imagine a different future, a world born anew. So thank you all for joining us, and please mark your calendars for the next lessons on resistance to authoritarianism on the third Thursday, May 15th, on Israel in the World, a Force for Authoritarianism, led by Phyllis Bennis and Carrie Peterson-Smith. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Carrie, and thank you, Netfa, for your help. And we will meet again.
Thank you.